In the last video, we took a look at the medieval church. In this video, we're going to take a look at towns and roads during the Middle Ages. Now, there were two key parts to medieval Europe. There was the feudal system and there were towns. In the next video, we will talk about feudal Europe. But in this video, we're going to focus on towns. Now, I should point out that during the Middle Ages, most people lived in the country, and towns were very, very small. In fact, it's estimated that 90% of the people lived in the country, and most of these people were part of the feudal system. Towns only comprised around 10% of the total population. Now, that would change near the end of the Middle Ages when towns became much larger and much more powerful. Now, inside the town's walls, freedom could be attained. Now, it wasn't a true democracy in the way we think of it. There were many rules and regulations that the townsfolk had to follow, but towns tended to pay homage to a king rather than a local feudal lord in the country. And so they sort of ran their own independent operation. And so again, there was freedom within the walls. So freedom was gained, but it was by no means a democratic society in the way we think of it. And so since all townsmen were free, some serfs would run away from their feudal lord to the towns. If they could remain there for a year, they were considered free and were not compelled to return to feudal society. And we'll talk a lot about that in the next video when we talk about feudalism. Now, many towns throughout the Middle Ages were formed at logical points. So a natural harbor might be a good place to form a city, or even a major road where people could set up shop and sell their goods. But rivers were really an advantageous area for a town to be formed. Other towns would grow up around monasteries and churches, and still other towns grew up around castles. And a lot of this had to do where people could find work. Churches actually provided employment and were also places that people could stay and eat and even earn a living. Now, one of the key ways towns began to grow was through merchants and tradesmen. And they would move into the towns to supply the daily needs of the citizens that were in the town. And we'll talk about merchants in the last slide because they really drove the growth of the medieval town. Now, as I talked about in previous videos, churches were usually the largest buildings. And so if you visited a medieval town, you would have seen all these tiny little houses clustered closely together. And in the center, there was this huge church. Most of the houses built in towns were constructed of wood. And what does that mean when homes are made of wood? That means they were susceptible to fire. And that actually was one of the biggest dangers to a medieval town. It actually was not an invasion, it was fire that was the biggest danger to a town. And when you had all of these houses closely packed together, that made towns inherently susceptible to fire damage. It also didn't help that roofs were usually made of straw. And so some of these places were like a tinderbox. And so many of these towns were an absolute fire hazard. And actually, if you travel throughout Europe today, you'll notice a lot of the roofs on houses are built with tile or shingles. And that actually started in the Middle Ages to reduce the possibility of fires. Now, you might ask the question, well, why didn't they build these houses out of stone? Well, the reason was that stone was extremely expensive. And so that's the reason many houses were built of wood. But eventually, stone building would become much more common when the price of stone decreased. And a new industry actually arose late in the Middle Ages, the brick industry. And so that shifted the momentum away from wood as the material of choice to brick. Now, one of the first things you would have noticed if you traveled to a medieval town are the walls. Endless walls. And you can see that right here in this model of a medieval town, this wall that surrounds the town. And this served a couple of purposes. One, it provided protection, but also it set boundaries, clear-cut boundaries about whose land this was. This was the town's land. And we still see walls throughout Europe today, but it's more at the individual home level. But it's still part of that European tradition to say where everything is. This is my land, this is not your land. This wall sets the boundary. I was recently in Portugal and I noticed that a lot of the homes had walls surrounding them. And when I made it back to the United States, it really sort of hit me that there's more walled homes in Europe than there are in the United States. And again, that arises from the Middle Ages. So again, strong walls would be built around these towns to protect the townspeople from invasion, and sometimes you could actually reuse the old Roman walls if you were lucky enough, and these usually were made out of stone. So again, if there was a pre-existing Roman wall, those could be reused. Now, there was law and order in these towns, and the law was enforced by a constable, and so the local constables had a lot of power. And so in the absence of a central authority, local government was all powerful. And that's what we see when the central authority of the Roman Empire collapsed. More power is returned to the local towns. It becomes a local affair. And I think this relates very well to the American Wild West, where town marshals and local judges were the power, because Washington at that time had little control over the areas in the West. They weren't even states yet, they were territories. And there's this great line from the movie Hang 'em High, where the judge tells Clint Eastwood, "I am the law." And he was not making that up. The local judges and sheriffs were the power. There was no state, there was no centralized government. And this is very similar to the Middle Ages, where the constables were the law. And so it was their duty to make sure the town was safe. Now, many towns locked the city gates at night, and that's because nighttime was very, very dangerous. And so to keep the peace, a curfew was established. And often, a bell would be rung at around 9 o'clock in the evening, and that was the signal that everybody was to move into their homes. And so bells were very important in the medieval town. They would indicate that the day was over and people again were to return to their homes. And that was enforced by the local constables. And if you were out at night and were caught, you better have a real good excuse for being out. And one of the reasons it was very dangerous at night was because there were no street lights. The only thing that could be used were candles. And again, candles were a fire hazard. So again, they really didn't have the ability to have street lights. So if you were out at night, chances are you were doing some pretty nefarious activities. Now the next day officially began with the ringing of the town bell. So if you walked down the street of a medieval town in the middle of the day, you would have noticed it was a very, very busy street. You would have seen people doing business, trading, and you would have seen a lot of livestock in the streets. Cats, dogs. It would have been a very lively place. And you would have seen a lot of pigs. They were cheap. They were a very good source of food for people in the Middle Ages. But as a result, there were a lot of stray animals, and especially stray pigs, which were a huge, huge nuisance. Now, one of the big issues in the Middle Ages was access to clean water, and that is there were no sanitation systems. Now, we know the Romans and the Greeks had extensive sanitation systems, and you can see in that picture on the right, those are Roman toilets. But all of that sort of disappears when the Roman Empire collapsed. And so when you do not have a sewage system, that will lead to diseases. And a lot of people during the Middle Ages threw toilet waste right out into the street with other trash. And so the streets would have been very, very dirty places. The rivers also were polluted, and that was because toilet waste was also thrown into the local river as well. And it would be even worse if your town was downstream from the other towns. But people in the Middle Ages had little choice. Their only source of water would have been the rivers and lakes, and as I said, many of those were polluted. And so the lack of clean water and sanitation lowered the life expectancy in the Middle Ages. And we can see that even in modern times. If you look at the 19th century and the 20th century, why did the life expectancies greatly increase? Now, you will hear about all of these medical advances, and those certainly contributed a role. But actually one of the biggest reasons was improvements to sanitation on a large scale. And so that's one of the biggest reasons why we see the life expectancy increase from the 19th to the 20th century. Sanitation methods greatly improved. Now, as I said, most of the streets were very, very messy, and the townsfolk would use these chamber pots to do their thing, and then they would empty the contents out into the streets. And so that was why a heavy rain was actually very beneficial, because it would wash most of this excrement away. Now, contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages did actually wash, but often they had to wash in cold water, and as I said, a lot of times that water was polluted. Only the wealthiest people had access to warm water. Everybody else had to wash in a river or use a bowl of cold water. That was all that was really available. One of the things that occurs with the breakdown of a major civilization are, of course, roads. Now, we know the Romans built an extensive transportation network throughout Europe, and basically wherever there were Roman provinces. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, roads began to fall apart because of the lack of maintenance. And Roman roads that had once been made of stone began to fall apart, and many turned into mud roads. And what does that result in? That results in a reduction in trade and communication. And so that's one of the things empires can do. They connect together through roads, point A and point B. It's almost like a guarantee of protection. And so you will hear this term, the Silk Road. And the Romans had a Silk Road, and even the Mongolians had a Silk Road. Now we hear about the Mongolians as being these savage barbarians, but they did succeed for the first time in connecting the East to the West through roads. And so they could guarantee that you could move to point A to point B and have a certain level of protection. And that's very, very important to be able to move your goods from point A to point B and not worry about being attacked by robbers or gangs. And if you think about the United States today, you will see that the highway system is very, very critical to the U.S. economy. And that's why we have state patrols whose only job is to protect the highways. And so that's a very important issue throughout history, is to protect the roads. And if you think about how reliant the United States is today on the trucking industry and the movement of goods and how reliant we are on the roads for commerce. Now imagine if all of that broke down and the roads were no longer maintained and we could no longer move goods from point A to point B. Well, things would fall apart pretty quickly. And so that's what happened in the Middle Ages. The roads eventually began to fall apart, but if you had traveled roads in the Middle Ages, you might have found that certain areas were maintained better than other areas. And that all had to do with the local authorities. Some roads may never have been repaired. Other areas might have been repaired more frequently. But again, it's the inconsistency that's the important point here. You don't have a central authority, as in the Roman Empire, maintaining these roads. And so your journeys across these roads were not necessarily guaranteed. Now, at the end of the Middle Ages, we see new roads for the first time being built and constructed, but to give you an idea how well organized the Romans were, it is believed that the road system in Europe did not return to the levels that the Romans established until the 1800s. Can you imagine that? It took almost 1,500 years later for the European roads to return to where they had been under the Romans. And so that's really a testament to Roman engineering. Now, who was traveling on these roads? Who would have been on the roads in the Middle Ages? Well, during Roman times, the Romans actually used these roads mostly for their military. So it was mostly used by the Roman legions to get to an area of conflict very quickly. During the Middle Ages, though, it was mostly used for traders. And we'll talk about traders in the next slide. But a lot of traders would go from town to sell their goods. It was also used for religious purposes. You would have seen a lot of religious pilgrims traveling to very important religious centers. And mainly that had to do with relics. A lot of people would travel long distances to be near a very, very important relic. Now, when you have roads that are not maintained, it's very difficult to move by carriage or cart. It's actually easier to travel long distances by horseback. And you can see this photograph of this Roman road on the left, and that's been pretty well maintained throughout the ages, as you can see. And then take a look at that very muddy road on the right. Well, which road would you prefer to travel? I'm guessing that nice Roman stone road on the left. Any event, let's move on. Now, one of the most important aspects in the later Middle Ages was the rise of the merchant class. Now, after the fall of the Roman Empire, we see this reduction in trade and communication. And we've mentioned some of the reasons for that in the previous slides. But as we move deeper and deeper into the Middle Ages, we see an increase in trade in the medieval towns. And so again, it is that rise of the merchant class that helps lead us out of the Middle Ages and into a new era. Now, why did people visit a town? Well, one of the primary reasons was trade, and more trade. A successful town attracted many merchants to it. And so the rise of this new class during the Middle Ages, the merchant class of course, stood in contrast to feudalism. Feudalism did not encourage trade. And so as towns became stronger and stronger and merchants grew more powerful, feudalism began to decline. And by about the year 1500, feudalism disappears from Europe altogether. Now, merchants provided a lot of skilled labor to these towns, which needed goods and services. So the merchants would make up carpenters, bakers, blacksmiths, candle makers, glass makers, dyers, potters, Anything you can think of that a town would need had these types of merchants. And so populations in these towns began to increase towards the end of the Middle Ages. And as I said, the growth of these towns eventually led to the complete breakdown of feudal society out in the country. Now, there were two types of guilds in these towns. There were merchant guilds and there were craft guilds. The merchant guilds controlled all of the trade in a town. And so these guilds would have had a lot of members, and the guild members were required to pay fees, and they usually had a central meeting place, a guild hall. And you can see that in this picture on the left. This is a medieval guild hall. Eventually, these guilds became highly specialized, so they might represent a specific type of product. And as I said, the merchant guilds controlled all the trade, they regulated the prices, and all of the guild business. There were also craft guilds, and these regulated the working hours and conditions for its members. And there were 3 levels of craftsmen. There were masters, there were journeymen, and there were apprentices. And we'll talk more about these guilds in future videos. Now, during the Middle Ages, there was not a concept of money. You traded in goods rather than money. And so if there was an exchange to be made, you would exchange one type of good for another type of good. But with the revival of trade and commerce, we begin to see the use of money making a comeback. And so with the rise in trade, the market square was a very, very important place in each town. And so these would have been very crowded and noisy places. But markets and fairs were the main way in which people could buy and sell goods. And these could be open throughout the week except for Sunday, which was the Lord's Day of rest. And so rarely were markets open on Sunday. Now, as I said, various people wanted to travel to a town to sell and trade their goods. And so towns would often establish gatehouses, and these were used to collect taxes. And so anybody that wanted to enter or leave a town had to pay a tax on all of the goods that were sold in the market. Now, as towns began to grow into these huge cities, great ports would be set up as well. So we see huge commercial centers like London and Paris, and these cities had numerous warehouses that would have been very close to the docks. And so a huge sea trade was established between many medieval cities. And you can see this boat right here. This is called a cog. And these were typical medieval boats that were used to transport supplies and equipment between the cities. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. I will see you guys in the next video when we'll talk about feudalism.